The greatest glory in living lies not in never falling, but in rising every time we fall. Nelson Mandela. Welcome to part 3 of the investigation into why there is a lack of space for redemption within our culture. So far we have outlined 2 causes for this. 1, the projection of the hero archetype. 2, the projection of the shadow archetype. So where do we go from here? Well, let's for a moment turn to a specific time and place in history. South Africa, 1994. Nelson Mandela was elected as the first black president of South Africa, symbolizing the end of apartheid and the beginning of a new era of unity and reconciliation. How did Mandela get to this moment and achieve what many thought was impossible? Well, Mandela grew up during a time of deep division within his culture. Apartheid enforced racial segregation within the nation of South Africa. Now, Mandela had a number of heroes, including Mahatma Gandhi. He was deeply inspired by the principles of non-violent resistance and civil disobedience. So in essence, Mandela projected the hero archetype onto Gandhi. However, he didn't get stuck in this phase. To me, this feels like a crucial moment in understanding how to successfully deal with the phenomena of archetypal projection. You see, projecting an archetype isn't inherently bad. In fact, it's a natural and necessary part of development. When one projects an archetype onto another, what they don't realize is that the archetypal energy is actually within themselves. When you project an archetype onto somebody, this actually serves a purpose. It allows you to identify important traits that are already within yourself. In essence, it's the first stage of activating the archetypal energy within the individual. Up until that point, it had been dormant. The next stage, however, is to withdraw the projection to realize and integrate the archetypal energy within yourself. So, returning to Mandela, he didn't just project the hero archetype onto Gandhi. He actually realized this potential within himself and acted it out in the world. In the 1940s and 50s, Mandela became increasingly involved in anti-apartheid activism. He participated in protests, strikes, and civil disobedience campaigns. So this is how he integrated the hero archetype that was activated by Gandhi's example. However, the government's response to peaceful resistance was brutal, which in turn changed Mandela. It led to the establishment of an armed wing and planning the sabotage of government facilities. In 1962, Mandela was arrested and sentenced to 5 years in prison for his involvement in the armed wing activities. He would later be sentenced to life in prison after the Rivonia trial in 1964, where he and other leaders of the African National Congress were accused of plotting sabotage and violent overthrow of the government. So Mandela spent 27 years in prison, where he experienced very harsh conditions. But it was during this time that he did something remarkable. He confronted his own anger, bitterness, and desire for revenge. In essence, he confronted his own shadow. Mandela could see that the anger and bitterness within himself had influenced his actions. His own shadow archetype was activated in the confrontation with the opposing forces of government. Despite the fact that his opposition were undoubtedly acting out their own shadow, Mandela had enough strength of character and wisdom to still confront his own shadow. He could see that it was the activation of his own shadow archetype that began to influence his decisions and led to him resorting to violence. If anyone really takes a moment to pause and reflect on a relationship or situation in their life where they feel deeply wronged, it feels almost impossible to focus on one's own anger and bitterness. Naturally, the overwhelming urge is to stay in the resentment of how the individual feels they have been wronged. In Mandela's case, it's all the more impressive that he didn't do this, considering the extremity of his experience and situation. But it was this very process that led to the transformation of not only himself, but the entire culture. Mandela's ability to recognize that the terrible traits existed in himself as much as his enemy is what allowed him to forgive. It was this very capacity to accept and integrate his own shadow that led to the collective doing the same. The culture followed in his footsteps and confronted their own dark nature. This was a crucial facet that enabled the nation's transformation and new unity. Nelson Mandela is a profound example of someone who was able to withdraw his projections, something that Carl Jung stated was a necessity. It was this very ability to withdraw these archetypal projections and integrate them that allowed him to choose a path of forgiveness and reconciliation. This ultimately led to a radical shift towards unity and turned him into a global symbol of peace. It seems to me that if we want to find a pathway back to a culture that has space for redemption, we must pay attention to Jung's wisdom and Mandela's example. We must withdraw our projections and learn to integrate them.